I am Ruben Hernandez Leon. I'm professor of sociology here at UCLA and director of the Latin American Institute. And this presentation is part of a larger effort by the Latin American Institute, the Asia Pacific Center, and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA that we call the Pacific World Research Network. And as part of this joint effort, we have a series of talks, presentations, seminars, online and in person, on the connections between Latin America and Asia. And we take both historical and contemporary perspectives. And there are some important themes, including migration control, migration regulation, migration governance. And today I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Julia Morris, who will be presenting on asylum and extraction in the Republic of Nauru. And let me just say a few things about Dr. Morris. She's Associate Professor of International Studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And this year, we are lucky, sort of regionally speaking, because she is a visiting politics faculty at Scripps College for the current and ongoing academic year. Dr. Morris holds a doctorate in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Oxford. Previously, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the New School Solberg Institute on Migration and Mobility, and a research student at Oxford Center on Migration Policy and Society. Her research focuses on the political economy of migration governance and outsourced border regimes, from ethnographic fieldwork in Nauru, Australia, and Geneva to research projects in Jordan and Guatemala. Spoiler alert, we plan to bring her back for in-person talk on campus, hopefully in the winter quarter, that will focus on the Guatemala part or component of this series of interconnected research projects. She has published widely and is the author of Asylum and Extraction in the Republic of Nauru, published in 2023, so fairly recent, I would say, with Cornell University Press. So welcome, Julia. Thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ruben, and thanks also to Ari for helping with the organization. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. And yeah, great to be here with all of you today, zooming in from relatively down the road in Claremont. Thanks very much for having me. So I thought I would open my presentation, which I just decided to stick with the name of my book because I feel like it really captures a lot of the themes that I'm trying to explore here. And I'm going to open with a short vignette. So back in 2015, I was sitting on the concrete wall of Nauru's boat harbor with Alexia. And Alexia was an Iranian asylum seeker who'd gone through a long journey to reach Australia. But as with other asylum seekers and refugees in Nauru, she'd been picked up in the Indian Ocean by the Australian Coast Guard and instead sent to the small Pacific island for asylum processing and resettlement. Alexia sighed as she described the industry that she saw operating around asylum, saying, "Each of us has a dollar sign on us. That's how they see us, just like commodities." And she continued, "Without us, this country would go bankrupt again. And look at all these Australian companies contracted here. Do you know how much they're getting? Multi-millions, and it's only a few of us here." So Alexia wasn't exaggerating, and by the time I arrived to conduct my fieldwork in Nauru, organizational contracts had topped the hundreds of millions. Along with Papua New Guinea's Manus Island, Nauru was at that time the principal seat of the Australian government's so-called regional processing arrangements. So Alexia urged me to use this stark analysis to get to the focus of my research, which centers on the political economy of migration. So, in particular, I look at the ways in which capitalists and political powers can benefit from increased migration securitization conditions. And in my work, I advance a theoretical framework of extractivism to understand the industry that revolves around the commodification of human mobility and specifically refugees as commodities. So my research hinges on this question of what forms of value are attached to refugees as commodities. And this question allows me to consider not only the financial value extracted by industry workers contracted into asylum and resettlement operations, and the geopolitical value of refugee crisis spectacles for politicians and media workers, but also the humanitarian moral values where refugees are the commodities at the center. So my overall argument is that asylum is an extractive industry, and I've come to this conclusion from examining policies regulating migration and asylum in a number of contexts, including research in Geneva, Jordan, Guatemala, and Nauru. And so today I'm going to be talking about a section of my most recent book project with Cornell, and it deals with the social life of the asylum industry in the microcosmic context of Nauru in the Pacific, pictured here. And I should say that all of these photos are my own unless I cite them otherwise. And this is actually a photo I took as I was coming into Nauru on the plane. And Nauru is very much a context where the extractivist logics around asylum are really stark. So it's the world's smallest island nation. It's just 21 kilometers squared. It's located 40 kilometers shy of the equator in Micronesia, northeast of Papua New Guinea. And I'm going to be speaking about the overlaps between Nauru's colonial and neo-colonial extractive enterprises around once processing phosphate and then processing migrants in order to understand some of the deep environmental and human consequences of what are essentially mineral and migrant resource sectors, and the imperial continuities that make some countries more susceptible to these hazardous extractive industry projects than others. So just in terms of my plan, I'll start by giving a little bit of background and detailing my approach and going through a few research findings. So some of my research from my fieldwork, and then putting it within an overall global landscape of border control. And I should say that these kinds of border externalization practices are very much not unique. Even in the early 20th century, countries intercepted, screened, and sometimes detained or deported migrants before they crossed national borders. So the focus was often on controlling migrants from colonies or poorer neighboring countries and maintaining so-called racial or national purity policies, as seen in Australia and the US. Um, in recent years, governments in the global north have continued these practices, so outsourcing border making processes to states in the global south. The Trump administration, of course, has sent undocumented migrants outside the US, often to third countries or overseas facilities under new, very much controversial arrangements. This includes deals with El Salvador to house deported migrants for $6 million a year. The US is also pushing African nations like Eswatini, South Sudan, Rwanda, Liberia, Senegal, Mauritania, the list very much goes on to accept people deported from third countries. And there's been very important research focused on the impacts of this kinds of outsourced border regime on migrants, but little on local residents. And instead, I found that advocacy campaigns often rely on a refugee victim local villain binary to leverage against third country asylum, as is the case with recent campaigns against the UK arrangement with Rwanda, which very much drew on these kinds of Conradian heart of darkness tropes to question the safety of the country for asylum seekers. Um, so I'm going to move into my fieldwork in Nauru to detail some of these local impacts and provide some thoughts on wider advocacy and a little bit of background to the Nauruan context. So this is the location of Nauru. Nauru doesn't fit the usual mold of a refugee resettlement country, normally characterized as one with a substantial domestic economy, home market, well-developed infrastructure and welfare system, or geographical proximity to sites of displacement. But with this sheer geographical isolation and minutiae context, Nauru didn't have a history of refugee processing or resettlement. So, once termed a company town by former President Ludwig Keke, Nauru's latest incarnation as a refugee processing and resettlement hub very much extends from a colonial history rooted in international commercial enterprise. So Nauru's remote location kept the coral atoll off the colonial radar longer than other Pacific islands in the region. But following global interest in fertilizer trades, Nauru catapulted onto the international trading scene in the late 19th century. And the scientific element of phosphorus and its isolation from limestone rock made the island a hub of the global fertilizer industry. So, across the first part of the 20th century, Nauru was colonially restructured in line with phosphate extraction under a tripartite British, Australian, and New Zealand League of Nations mandated, but then later UN Civilizational Trust territory, and essentially British Phosphate Commission control. This is a photo I took that I think really illuminates the company town feel that you find throughout the entire country. This is actually one of the phosphate processing factories in the background of a soccer pitch. But in 1968, the island population asserted their independence as a parliamentary republic on the back of phosphate wealth. And nationalized phosphate mining briefly made Nauru one of the wealthiest countries in the world under the government-owned Republic of Nauru Phosphate Corporation. So Nauru was actually propelled to having the world's second highest GDP per capita after Saudi Arabia. And the country filled with sports cars, imported goods, and fast food. These are photos of two of Nauru's investments. On the left-hand side, this is the Grand Hotel in Suva in Fiji. And then on the right-hand side, this is Nauru House in downtown Melbourne. And I was actually a couple years ago in Honolulu for AAG, and I came across Nauru Towers in Waikiki. It's now no longer owned by the Nauruan government. Instead, it's actually wealthy condos. All of these, of course, not bad investment ideas, but they went completely mismanaged. And environmental depletion and near bankruptcy, coupled with some of the highest diabetes and obesity rates worldwide, which really led Nauru to the brink of disaster. There were failed forays into offshore banking, 5 million Australian dollars lost in the unsuccessful London Broadway musical, Leonardo, A Portrait of Love, another $24 million to investment scams, all of which led Nauru to accept Australia's most recent industry package. But until 2001, Nauru didn't have a history of refugee processing or resettlement. The country wasn't a signatory to the Refugee Convention. It didn't have its own national asylum procedures. Among many in the government and in the public I spoke with, there being little understanding of what a refugee was. But then under 2001, then 2012 agreements, the cash-strapped sovereign state, bankrupt in the 1990s from these ostentatious days of phosphate wealth, resurged on the back of refugee wealth, importing Australia's maritime asylum-seeking populations in exchange for a growth sector for economic reform. This is a photo of former Nauruan President Baron Waka and former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, neither of whom were originators of the deal, but they were part of a successive line of government figures on both sides of the political spectrum who sustained this arrangement. So, under this arrangement, anyone who made their way by boat, usually from Indonesia or Sri Lanka, and put forward an asylum claim in Australian territorial and now excised waters, was offshored to Nauru or to PNG for refugee processing and resettlement. The majority of people originally came from a range of countries, including Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Vietnam. And if certified as refugees by seconded Australian Immigration Department personnel, asylum seekers were then given a refugee visa for indefinite stay in Nauru. And behind the scenes, the Australian government then funded and continues to fund small business startups for refugees to encourage their integration in the small island nation. This is a photo I took of Nauru's new courthouse. It was built for refugee appeals, so people appealing their refugee status determination denials. Ironically, their other courthouse was actually taken up with phosphate land disputes, which is why they built this new courthouse. And I should say also, very recently, in August 2025, a new deal was announced with Nauru. So in exchange for $1.6 billion over 3 decades, Nauru is housing up to 354 people living in Australia whose visas were cancelled on character grounds, often very low infractions. And this arrangement, of course, extends from Nauru's on and off again relationship with Australia as a site for asylum processing and long-term refugee resettlement. So Management and Training Corporation, MTC, it's the third largest private prison operator in the US. They actually manage the Nauru facilities now through their Australian subsidiary. And recent reports have shown a total value of around almost $800 million to hold approximately 100 people. So it's an annual cost of nearly $1.5 million per person. So massive amounts of money. Histrionic debates about national security and border control, coupled with a deep history of selective nation building, all of which constitute some of the political currency of offshoring asylum and externalizing borders for Australia. This is a still from a video designed to deter asylum seekers as part of Operation Sovereign Borders. And this is Angus Campbell, who was formerly the commander of the operation, is now the Australian Defence Force chief. And I think this type of advertising campaign really touches on some of the geopolitical value of the border spectacle, but particularly as it revolves around so-called boat people. So Sivendrini Pereira argues that moral panics surrounding boat people extend from unresolved anxieties of a still colonial nation founded on the usurpation of indigenous land and sovereignty, with, of course, in deep contradiction, settler colonialists coming from the sea in the first place. And this is, as Ghassan Haj points out, very much symptomatic of a Western siege mentality, once specific to settler colonial societies, which now very much composes the contemporary global order. So, in exchange for their role in this arrangement, the Nauruan government has, since 2001, received over 5 billion Australian dollars. It's just over 3.2 billion US dollars. Um, Even as the number of asylum seekers sent to Nauru has stalled, it was about a high of 1,200 people in 2014 to around 60 people remaining today, coupled with those recently being sent to the island through this new arrangement. The processing and resettlement contract remains extremely lucrative, and the Nauruan government estimates that the revenue from hosting a regional processing regime was 67% of their total government revenue. That was between 2012 to 2022, sort of at the height of this arrangement. The numbers of asylum seekers sent to Nauru has been very small, so just over 1,300 people when I was carrying out my fieldwork between 2013 and 2016. But in comparison to Nauru's wider population of 10,500 people, these numbers have been very significant for the country and the global spectacle of border control at large. And they speak to the statistical inflations from right and leftist liberal representations, where dominant narratives about migration tend to focus on the relatively small numbers of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants attempting to reach the global north, where particularly Southern refugees and racialized migrants have become these kinds of floating signifiers, to use Stuart Hall's term, empty symbols onto which societies project their anxieties and fears. And these are some photos I took of some of the many ways that Nauru had resurged through the asylum industry. On the left-hand side, this is locals jet skiing in the boat harbor. On the right-hand side, this is one of many cocktail bars that had opened around the island, mostly catering to fly in, fly out Australian personnel who were contracted into various parts of the asylum industry arrangement. This was actually ladies' night. This was one of the methodologies of going around these cocktail bars. And this is one of the many bingo holes that had opened in the middle, this photo, that had pretty substantial cash prizes. I think there was actually a motorbike that was going with this one. So recent scholarship in anthropology, political ecology, human geography, development economics, sociology, all calls for a broader rethinking of extractivism as what Carmen Martinez Novo describes as a paradigm of severe exploitation characteristic of late capitalism. So moving beyond extraction, extractivism is an ideological construct, an analytical and political concept connected to deep logics of exploitation and subjectification. Extractivism isn't just defined by, as Benzadra and Nielsen put it, the forced removal of raw materials and life forms from the Earth's surface, depths, and biosphere, but also by the opening of new frontiers and the urge to find untapped substances to turn into commodities. Environmentalists, including many Pacifica scholars and activists, have long recognized the impact of resource extraction on world ecosystems, whether that's June Nash in the 1970s, to Susanna Sawyer, Tarcisius Capitulaca, Katerina Teawa more recently in relation to Banaba and phosphate extraction in Banaba or Ocean Island. But to date, the impact of human economies hasn't featured prominently in these discussions. So, my theoretical framework applies a political economic analysis to thinking about refugees as commodities and developing scholarship from the extractivism literature to consider the political, economic, and moral values extracted from migrants as refugees, and very much prioritizing the knowledges of individuals in toxic areas who, of course, are best placed to observe the accumulation of environmental and other changes over time. This is a photo in the background from my fieldwork of an asylum seeker catching a lift up to the regional processing centers on the top of Nauru's phosphate atoll in the shadow of a phosphate processing factory. And I thought it really illuminates these stark industry convergences. I also used it as the front cover of my book. I'm also building on work from migration studies into what Gameltoft, Hansen, and Sorensen term the migration industry, and Digenova and Anderson the illegality industry, which looks at the state and non-state actors that profit from the governance of human mobility. So more specifically, contracted workforces, politicians, media workers gain through the representation of border securitization. Electoral support for right-wing anti-immigrant platforms rides on the production of hysteria around the other, from border security and detention management corporations to healthcare providers, humanitarian organizations, legal firms, research institutes. There's a range of private actors and transnational networks that have a stake in the migration industry and an increased securitization. My work is also challenging some of the previous scholarship around the migration industry, which tends to present social movements in apolitical terms, by showing how discourses of humanitarianism can also play a part in the maintenance of human resource sectors. So I emphasize that the focus on the migration industry needs to look a little bit more closely at the involvement of left liberal actors. And Nauru is more popularly known on the global scene through discourses of Nauruan violence, underdevelopment, and savagery, and of routine refugee abuse. Given the lack of research conducted in Nauru or from those not associated with activist campaigns, it's unsurprising that a lot of scholarship comes from that perspective. There's been next to no research that's been conducted in Nauru and none on the country's asylum industry operations. Part of this is owing to exorbitantly priced visa fees of 8,000 Australian dollars for journalists and researchers, partially done by the Nauruan government to ward off activists and also to earn some extra revenue. Of course, racialized and exoticized imaginaries are Regis Stella, Naihamui, Michelle Rooney, all point out very much paradigmatic for the region. And in Nauru, these portrayals have very much shaped contemporary Western representations that continue to regard Nauruans as inferior and as inherently violent. So in my research, I draw together multi-sited ethnographic research. It was conducted over 15 months, involving over 120 interviews, time spent with contracted personnel, including asylum seekers and refugees and activists and advocates in Australia. My research geographically spans speaking with UN representatives in Geneva, NGO, corporate, and state industry contractors in Australia, delving into colonial archives in Fiji and London, and then living in Nauru between 2015 and 2016. And I've recently updated this with further ethnographic fieldwork into externalization hotspots, including Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean, as well as looking at similar dynamics of US border outsourcing to Guatemala and EU border outsourcing to Jordan. So in Nauru, I was a research student affiliated with Nauru's small University of the South Pacific campus. That allowed me to evade the visa fees. I was able to come and go as I chose, provided that I didn't go into the regional processing centers. And I actually found that this was unnecessary because the centers were already open to in and out movement at that time, and the entire country operated essentially as a processing and resettlement hub. In Nauru, I lived with locals and foreign administrative personnel, so I got a lot of deep insights into the realities of the country's phosphate and asylum industries. And I should say that I think my positionality as neither Nauruan or Australian helped. A number of islanders commented that they would face social constraints of doing this research. So, reluctant to document sensitive information that might implicate relatives or neighbors in a close-knit island community. And I should say also that I use pseudonyms throughout my research and also composite identities in order to be very sensitive to that myself. Um, but I could navigate these kinds of relationships without local kinship obligations. And also, my non-Australian identity allowed me to avoid the immediate categorization and suspicion that often greets Australian researchers, who are frequently assumed to be aligned with advocacy groups or political agendas critical of the offshore processing regime. That's not to say that there weren't ethical challenges to navigate, but this dual distance created a space of relative trust that positioned me as someone who could listen to multiple perspectives without the presumption of predetermined loyalties. So, moving on to some of my results. During my fieldwork, I found that there were deep overlaps between the material life of infrastructure around phosphate and refugee processing. As industrial production has shifted from phosphate to refugees in Nauru, so have infrastructural forms. So, three gleaming regional processing centers cropped up with rapid speed on the country's once phosphate extraction atoll after the arrangement was announced. This is a photo you can see in the background here, the white roofs of the three centers, and then in the foreground, the phosphate extraction fields. During my field work, 31% of the local population was employed directly in industry labor forces, and that rose really swiftly from just 7% in 2013, and it very much overtook the country's beleaguered phosphate industry, which fell dramatically. And that's not to mention, of course, the rise of ancillary industries. Colonial phosphate commissioner bungalows were repurposed for the asylum industry, occupied by corporate elites connected to the Australian Immigration Department, as well as industry contractors and refugee resettlement services. And the infrastructure frenzy spread across the atoll as the Australian company Construct built a new hotel, hospital, school, courthouse, road system. Legal, economic, and even police and education structures were all remodeled in line with the demands of processing and resettling refugees. And many of these convergences exhibit close connections to the violence and domination that originated with colonial conquest in Nauru, extending what Anne Stoler terms patterns of imperial debris to describe the material residues of deeply destructive colonial projects on places over time. So I'm just going to run through a few photos from my fieldwork that I think really illuminate these convergences and speak to the material life of value. Um, so these are examples of phosphate and asylum industry housing. On the left-hand side, you have this kind of bucolic company town style architecture from Nauru's phosphate heyday. In the middle, this is new housing, sort of similar in style, but built for offshore asylum industry workers, mostly at the time Australian security guards and teachers sent to supplement Nauru schools when children were being resettled in the country. And on the far right, this is former executive British Phosphate Commissioner housing, which was then occupied by executive personnel connected to Canstruct, the Australian construction company. And this is a photo of Royalty Day. So on the left-hand side is the Phosphate Royalties Collection Office, where landowners would go once a month to receive payments for the amount of phosphate extracted from their land. On the right-hand side is Refugee Royalties Day, where landowners who owned what's termed the lucrative land leased to the Australian government and their industry contractors will also receive monthly rental payments. And I should say this also shows some of the uneven distributions of benefits from historical phosphate mining and contemporary extractive ventures. Nauru, of course, has internal class structures and power dynamics where different social groups have navigated and profited from or been marginalized by economic arrangements. But ultimately, like the environmental destruction of phosphate, from these findings, I argue that refugees are an industry that's actually had a hugely negative impact on local and migrant populations. So, underneath a proud fanfare in Nauru, where refugee resettlement houses sprang up around the atoll's urban fringe, as more asylum seekers received refugee status in Nauru after assessment, and where local government ministers talked about the wonders of multicultural diversity. Um, Hunger strikes, self-immolation attempts, self-harm, and riots very much erupted among refugees on a constant basis. This is a photo I took of protests that were happening outside of refugee resettlement compounds. Um, no migrant expected to find themselves on the small Pacific island in indefinite limbo, unable to move beyond the island confines except through a resettlement offer to Cambodia. You can see a banner here that says "No Cambodian inside, Cambodia never ever." And then later a US deal, but that was available only for a small number of the refugee population. There were a great deal of tensions between some locals and some refugees, and this was partially owing to a high-profile global media narrative in which Nauruans were often depicted through civilizational discourses of savagery and underdevelopment. At the same time, there was a lot of resentment felt by locals at the welfare system set up for refugees in Nauru. Gina, a Nauruan islander, said to me, "I'd be treated much better if I took a boat to Australia and got sent back here as a refugee." So many Nauruans, including Gina, were in fact sympathetic and disagreed with the country's newest industry project, some forging close friendships with asylum seekers and refugees. But she and most local islanders were upset about the continuous presentation of the country on the Australian and global stage. Um, and this is also the case with civilizational developmentalist narratives of third world backwardness and barbarism versus first world freedom that we so often see in other representations of countries in the global south that agree to similar arrangements. And this leads me to my last finding in that many of these tensions were exacerbated by activist campaigners from the left and the right in Australia. High-profile leftist campaigns at the time of my fieldwork focused on a refugees welcome and let them stay narrative. Media headlines like "We will fucking kill you," beaten Nauruan refugees fear for their lives, and "Refugees on Nauru plead for resettlement," through to a more recent language of evacuation, when referring to the remaining refugees in Nauru, some of whom were able to leave for Australia, can depoliticize refugees as voiceless victims, saved by mostly white Australian activists in developed countries. So, in seeking to legitimize the issue and to mobilize political support, I found that social movements run the risk of advancing racialized representations of the Nauruan as savage and the refugee as vulnerable in counter to the so-called modern West. Racialized migrants are depicted as uniquely vulnerable refugees in need of rescue from their barbaric culture, a colonial construction that justifies Western imperial interventionism, which ironically pushes more people to have to migrate. And this also makes mutual experiences of exploitation disappear from records. Um, and it only serves to reinforce the racial stereotypes of people, refugees as threats, Nauruans as savage, and places, refugee origin countries, and Nauru as Conradian hearts of darkness, that have in the past bolstered the depiction of offshore asylum as a strategy of deterrence. Meanwhile, migrants and Nauruans bear the tolls of the destructions attendant with these forms of essentially human extraction and exploitation. So, in conclusion, returning to my original question, in my talk, I've been thinking through some of the social realities of the asylum industry in Nauru. I've described the forms of financial, geopolitical, and moral value extracted from refugees as objectified commodities, and also described how Nauru continues to be enmeshed in a deep industrial complex and colonial dependency, which makes it difficult to move out of ethically dubious terrain as essentially the handmaiden of a much larger neighbor. And these vast infrastructural projects seem to follow a similar trajectory in that massive amounts of investment go into the harmful extraction of human and non-human resources. At a financial cost of well over 7 billion US dollars, Nauru's newest extractive endeavor has left a legacy of human suffering for both refugees and the people of Nauru. And this adds to the multitude of stories of environmental and health degradations from Nauru's phosphate years about extractive industries and the landscapes they leave behind. Um, and as of this talk today, as I said, a small number of refugees remain living in the country but can't leave the islands. And along with the US, some have been resettled in Canada and New Zealand, but Nauru continues to be financed by the Australian government. Meanwhile, the Nauruan government is very much in dire financial straits. They recently severed diplomatic ties with Taiwan, restoring relations with the People's Republic of China in exchange for 100 million US dollars a year. The government is also experimenting with a golden passport initiative, through which the state sells citizenship to wealthy foreigners, demonstrating how economic pressures rooted in colonial extraction continue to shape Nauru's relationship with global capital in increasingly stark ways. Um, and Nauru is also moving towards new forms of extraction through significant involvement in facilitating deep sea mining operations for international corporations. Um, at the same time, periodic king tides cover the country's main ring road. Seawalls protect some residents, but impoverished neighborhoods like location, pictured here, experience the wrath of flooding on a regular basis. Ironically, Nauruans might find themselves becoming refugees from a past economy and managing refugees. Um, and despite the impacts on border externalization on local and migrant populations, many governments have looked to the Australian style practice of outsourcing border operations. Many of the regions where Western countries have financed border enforcement projects exhibit continuities from histories of colonial resource extraction through to the extractive projects of the contemporary era. So my next book project is actually bringing together my fieldwork in different outsourced border sites, Jordan and Guatemala, with archival research in Geneva to think about the varying impacts of these kinds of externalized border arrangements, but through the lens of resource frontiers. And something I'm directly engaged in is how we can disrupt these modes of perennial extractivism. So one approach I'm advancing is the importance of representation and social justice goals. So moving towards more egalitarian practices of solidarity, coalitions, and commonality, rather than ones of suffering, salvation, and human valuation, as identified by Alexia in my opening vignette. So, we've seen that free movement can easily happen with the extension of EU residency rights to Ukrainian nationals and permanent residents without the requirement to go through asylum procedures. So rather than mobilizing problematic dichotomies of refugee abuse and local human atrocities, focusing on intersectional advocacy that can highlight the toxic effects of extractive outsourced border regimes on local and migrant populations alike, and instead considering forms of free movement that go outside the international refugee regime. Another important aspect of this approach is flagging up Indigenous refugee solidarities, but in ways that move beyond an ethics based on uncritical celebrations of relationality. So, ways that can be used by governments and their corporate and non-governmental contractors to rose tint asylum regimes, moving to what Eva Haifa Girard terms an ethics of exclusion. So rather than realizing relational modes of ethics, paying more attention to ways of being that are foreclosed when other entangled realities are materialized. And that's quoting Girard in What Comes After Entanglement. So instead of creating hierarchies of humanity that pit migrants against natives, which Nandita Sharma points out was fundamental to colonial rule, this approach pays attention to intersectional inequalities. This is an example I'm going to close with of alternative solidarities that were never made visible beyond Nauru. So this rap group, it was made up of Nauruan and refugee teenagers who collaborated not on celebrating the multicultural harmony of Nauru as the Australian Immigration Department envisaged, who funded this entire collaboration, including all of the technology and music software. But instead, they focused on voicing their opposition to the offshore arrangement through articulating shared conditions of exploitation. This isn't, of course, to say that conflicts don't develop between refugees and Nauruans and also between refugees, but to point out that rather these tensions are symptomatic of the broader frictions of a toxic extractive industry that's created pressures that can also generate resentment and discord. So outsourced border and asylum regimes continue to advance, as do political narratives surrounding migrant deterrence from global south to north. And it becomes, I think, increasingly urgent to explore the relationship between privileged and stigmatized immobility and also the commonalities of experiences. So thanks everyone for being here and very much looking forward to our discussion.
Wonderful, Julia. Thank you. Thank you very much. This was a great presentation. So many insights and ideas, and definitely it just gives it's whetting our appetite, I think, for bringing you to campus in person to hear more about the sort of extension of this project with multiple. Countries that are being used as sources of externalization. Well, this is the moment when we ask the audience to type their questions. Please use the Q&A button to type questions for our speaker, Julia Morris, Dr. Julia Morris. And let's see, hopefully questions will be coming shortly. But we actually have in my department, in fact, several people who are on the call here who work on border externalization and the sort of use and funding of countries in the global south as sort of depositories, quote unquote, of migrants, asylum seekers, deportees, and also this actually dovetails as well with even with the experience of returnees, some of which actually are at times even processed in third countries,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, let's see, we have any questions coming. Can you give us just a brief synopsis or just a little bit of what you're seeing in Guatemala in comparison to Nauru? Of course, again, we will get more details when you give a full presentation
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
winter here.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so where I was focused on in Guatemala was in the northern Petén region. So somewhere where people are largely making their way from Honduras and then potentially through northern Guatemala into Mexico. It's a very rainforested region. And something I had been observing was the massive amount of promotional campaigns through ACNUR, UNHCR, being funded to try and encourage people to claim asylum locally, as well as little minibuses that would go out in sort of harder to reach areas where humanitarian workers would quite literally hand out pamphlets encouraging people to claim asylum for Guatemala and to Guatemala's kind of growing asylum system. So different in that in Nauru, people are not intending to pass through, or nor would they logically pass through Nauru. People are being sent there and held there, whereas Guatemala being seen as potentially a so-called transit state, and so a lot of work and organizational effort and sort of quite bucolic kind of humanitarian imaginaries being created in order to encourage people to stay locally, of World Refugee Days being set up, for example, which is something I observed in Nauru too. I mean, Nauru set up a World Refugee Day um, quite controversially, but
Of
yeah.
course. Okay, so we have several questions coming kind of like at the same time. So I'm going to start reading and asking you to please answer those or address them. Yael writes, who have been the major phosphate purchasers? And Yael is also asking, any idea if there have been transnational linkages, alliances between locals and Sahrawis who have been fighting phosphate extraction from Western Sahara, particularly as purchased by the EU, for the last several years.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, so in the past it was Australia, and during the colonial extractive years, very cut price phosphate, of course, and but then more recently, it's actually Japan is one of the main purchasers, I was told. Um, and Japan actually, there was a brief period of Japanese occupation in Nauru, very violent Japanese occupation in Nauru, I should say. But now Japan is one of the main purchasers. I haven't heard about any linkages or alliances in that way. Honestly, um, a lot of attempted advocacy against phosphate mining, even though it's well recognized locally how destructive it is and has been, is squashed. So even when I spoke with someone in the local health department who had tried to put out a report related to the massive amounts of massive incidents of respiratory diseases locally, was basically told to nuke the report. And just as something that people have derived so much benefit economically, there's a a definite tension between wanting to be open and advocate against something that you see and you feel bodily is so destructive, but at the same time has also formed your island's livelihood. So I haven't heard about any kind of there hasn't been much in the way of massive advocacy against it. Um,
And Sienna, let me see if let's go to the next question. Sienna Ruiz, thank you for an incredible talk. I wanted to ask, what do you consider the key differences researchers must consider when considering a human-based extractive industry versus one based on natural environmental resources? And how can researchers account for these differences in their methods or theoretical development?
That's a great question. Thanks, Yana. I would say definitely avoiding a, I guess the trap would be objectifying people, even though you don't mean to, and directly making parallels with individuals uh, as um, and parallels with inanimate resources, I think can be incredibly problematic. Um, so being very much attentive to how those who you're working with express the impacts of that extractive industry on themselves. So that's why, I very much prioritized Alexia, pseudonym, but very much prioritized her analysis of actually pointing me towards that and saying, no, this is actually, this is very much true. And I see myself objectified. But making sure that, I'm not leveling that sort of analysis on individuals in a way that can be very problematic and extractive and liken people to non-human extractive non-human commodities. Um, and Another aspect, actually, one more thing I would say as well, is the ways in which, in the case of Asylum, um, Asylum is also, of course, been incredibly beneficial legal system for people in order to be able to access protection and access possible residency within a place. So one of the tensions for me was thinking about how to navigate a situation where people are also, wanting to assert their own identity and their own subjectivity as refugees. So that's another part of it. But that's a really great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Roxanne writes, resource extraction implies that agency lies with the extracting country, e.g. Australia. However, there is some work showing the agency of the host country in negotiating for contracts. How would you describe the different positions of the governments of Australia and Nauru in the creation of these agreements?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, because I definitely don't want to fall into the trap of, victimized host country. Because there has been a lot of profit derived, and local government elites have actually been big negotiators and trying to encourage the Australian government to continue furthering these arrangements, even though there's been a lot of pushback locally and there hasn't been local consultation. And I should say that, yeah, the various members of the Nauruan government, and some members of the government also not agreeing, and think being concerned for ethical reasons more than anything else. But some members in the Nauruan government being quite instrumental in actually being able to leverage for a lot of benefits locally, whether that's financial or whether that's, building of infrastructure, I mean, building of hospitals and schools, and making sure that's a part of the package. So yeah, locally there has been in some elite quarters a lot of leverage in order to acquire as much benefit as possible. Yeah.
Thank you. Um, Evan, or Even, I hope I'm probably mispronouncing the name. Apologies for that. Writes, I would love to hear more about the alternative solidarities that you mentioned at the end between refugee and Nauru teen rappers. What language, rhetoric are they using to articulate the solidarities? What do they see as points of connection between their grounded critiques of the Australian and Nauru states?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. That's a great question as well. So decolonial framing. So thinking through, the ways in which Nauruans have been historically exploited through colonial extractive projects on their land, through to uh, refugees finding a kind of a commonality, finding a commonality with refugee experiences and vice versa, of some of the Nauruan refugee rappers. Sorry, the refugee rappers and the Nauruan teens, finding ways to talk about how this is a contemporary neocolonial extractive industry where in which refugees are very much entangled. So it was very much through a decolonial and neocolonial lens that they were talking about those commonalities of experiences.
Thank you. I actually, when you were talking about, when you were explaining your critique of sort of liberal positions or the construction of Nauruans, the Nauruan government, the Nauruan state, in the eyes or the positions of liberal uh, allies of sorts, right, in Australia. You made me think of the work of Laura Agustin and Sex at the
Mm.
Margins,
Yeah.
because of that is also a very powerful critique of construction of particular subjects, migrant sex workers in her case. And I don't know if you see a sort of a connection in that critique that you have deployed in her work.
Yeah, I've actually been really influenced by a lot of the sex trafficking, the critical sex trafficking literature that critiques that kind of white savior narrative in terms of humanitarian advocacy. So that's actually been very influential and informative for my thinking. I think there's a lot of parallels.